They took shelter outside of Boulder, in a cookie-cutter subdivision that had seen better days. 5 or 6 floor plans, Dave Carrons figured. Black facades and tan siding, crumbling streets and blank cul-de-sacs. No place you'd want to live. By then, Felicia had passed out from the pain, and the snow beyond the windshield of Lanyon's black Yukon had thickened into an impenetrable white blur. It had been a spectacular run of bad luck, starting with the first news of the virus via the satellite radio in the Yukon. 3 days of disease vectors and infection rates, symptoms and speculation. Calm voices gave way to anxious ones, and anxious ones succumbed to the panic. The last they heard was the sound of a commentator retching. Then flat silence, nothing at all the length of the band. NPR, CNN, the Outlaw County station, and suddenly no one was anxious to go home. None of them. Not Carrons and Felicia, not Lanyon or his new girlfriend, Natalie, lithe and blonde and empty-headed as the last player in the rotating cast of female companions. On the 3rd day of the catastrophe, when it became clear that humanity just might be toast, they'd powwowed around a fire between the tents, passing hand-to-hand the last of the primo dope Lanyon had procured for the trip. Lanyon always insisted on the best. Tents and sleeping bags that could weather a winter on the Ross ice shelf, a high-end water filtration system, a portable gas stove with more bells and whistles than the full-size one Karen's and Felicia used at home. Even a Benelli R1 semi-automatic hunting rifle, just in case, Lanyon had said. The most remote location as well, somewhere 2,000 feet above Boulder, where the early November deciduous trees began to give way to pinyon pine and Rocky Mountain juniper. 0 cell phone reception, but by that time, there was nobody really left to call. Or anyway, none of them cared to make the descent and see. The broadcast had started calling it the Red Death by then. Karen's appreciated the illusion. Airborne, an incubation period of less than 24 hours, blood leaking from your eyes, your nostrils, your pores, and toward the end, 12 hours if you were lucky, another 24 if you weren't, gushing from your mouth with every cough. No thank yous all around. Safe enough at 7,500 feet, at least for the time being. The time being, Lanyon insisted, lasting at least through the winter and maybe longer. We have maybe 2 weeks worth of food, Karen's protested. We'll scout out a cabin and hunker down for the duration, Lanyon said. If we have to, we'll hunt. There was that at least. Lanyon was a master with the Benelli. They wouldn't starve, and Karen's didn't have any more desire to contract the Red Death than the rest of them. All had been going according to plan. Inside a week, they'd located a summer cabin, complete with a larder of canned goods, and had started gathering wood for the stove. Then Felicia had fallen. A single bad step on a bed of loose scree, and that had been it for the plan. When Karen's cut her jeans away, he saw that the leg had broken at the shin. Yellow bone jutted through the flesh. Blood was everywhere. Felicia screamed when Lanyon set the bone, yanking it back into true, or something close to true, splinting it with a couple of backpack poles and binding the entire bloody mess with a bandage they found in a first aid kit under the sink. The bandage had soaked through almost immediately. Karen's, holding her hand, thought for the first time in half a dozen years of their wedding. The way she looked in her dress and the way he'd felt inside, like the luckiest man on the planet. Luck. It had all turned sour on them. I'm taking her down first thing in the morning, he told Lanyon. What for? You heard the radio. We're on our own now. You want to die too? Natalie asked. I don't want her to die, Karen said. That was the point. Without help, she was doomed. Anybody could see that. There wasn't a hell of a lot any of them could do on their own. A venture capitalist and a college English professor, and something else, a Broncos cheerleader maybe, who knew what Natalie did. Even if it's as bad as we think it is down there, Karen's added, we can still find a pharmacy, antibiotics, whatever. You think there's any chance her leg isn't going to get infected? Grim-faced, Lanyon had turned away. I think it's a bad idea. You have a better one? How are you going to get down there, Dave? You planning to use the Yukon? Karen's laughed in disbelief. I can't believe you'd even say that. What? Lanyon said, as if he didn't know. You were the best man at my wedding. Hell, you introduced me to Felicia. The rules have changed, Natalie had said. We have to think of ourselves now. Fuck you, Natalie, Karen said, and that had been the end of the conversation. He was wakeful most of the night that followed. Felicia was feverish. Am I gonna die, Dave? She had asked in one of her lucid moments. Of course not, he responded, the light cleaving his heart. Lanyon woke him at dawn. They stood shivering on the porch of the cabin and watched clouds mass among the peaks. The temperature had plunged overnight. The air smelled like snow. "You win," Lanyon said. "We'll go down to Boulder." The snow caught them when they were winding down the rutted track from the cabin. Big lazy flakes sifting through the barren trees to land on the Yukon's acres of windshield. Nothing really to worry about, Karen's thought in the back seat, cradling Felicia's head in his lap. But the temperature, visible in digital blue on the dash, continued to plummet. 25, 15, 10. By the time they hit paved road, a good hour and a half from the cabin, and in itself a narrow, serpentine stretch of crumbling asphalt, the snow had gotten serious. The wipers carved slanting parabolas in the snow. Beyond the windows, the world had receded into a white haze. Lanyon hunched closer to the wheel. They crept along, pausing now and again to inch around an abandoned vehicle. "We should have stayed where we were," Natalie said, and the silence that followed seemed like assent. But it was too late to turn back now. Finally, the road winded into a 4-lane highway, clogged with vehicles. They plowed onward anyway, weaving drunkenly among the cars. By the time they reached the outskirts of Boulder, the headlights stabbed maybe 15 feet into the swirling snow. "I can't see a thing," Lanyon said. They turned aside into surface streets, finding their way at last into the decaying subdivision. They picked a house at random, a rancher with a black facade in an empty cul-de-sac. The conventions of civilization held. Lanyon and Karen scouted it out while the women waited in the Yukon. They knocked, shouting, but no one came. Finally, they tested the door. It had been left unlocked. The owners had departed in a hurry, Cairns figured, fleeing the contagion. He wondered if they had passed them dead somewhere on the highway, or if they had made it into higher altitudes in time. The house itself was empty. Maybe they had gotten lucky. Maybe the frigid air would kill the virus before it could kill them. Maybe, Karen's thought. Maybe. They settled Felicia on the sectional sofa in the great room, before the unblinking eye of the oversized flat screen. Afterward, they searched the place more thoroughly, dousing Felicia with the amoxicillin and the oxycodone they found in the medicine cabinet. Then the food in the pantry, tools neatly racked in the empty garage, and a loaded pistol on a bedside table. Natalie tucked it in the belt of her jeans. Cairns flipped the light switches, adjusted the thermostat, flicked on the television. Nothing. Welcome to the end of the world, it said. Not with a bang, but a whimper. The snow kept coming, gusts of it, obscuring everything a dozen feet beyond the windows, then unveiling it in quick flashes. The blurred limb of a naked tree, the shadow of the Yukon at the curb. Karen stood at the window as night fell, wondering what he'd expect to find. A hospital? A doctor? The hospitals must have been overwhelmed from the start. The doctors first to go. The streetlights snapped alight, solar-charged batteries, the death throes of the world he'd grown up in. They illuminated clouds of billowing white that in other circumstances Karen's would have found beautiful. Cold groped at the window. He turned away. Lanyon and Natalie had scrounged a handful of tea-light candles. By their flickering luminescence, the great room took a cathedral air. Darkness encroached from the corners and gathered in shrouds at the ceiling. They ate pork and beans warmed over the camp stove, spread their sleeping bags on the carpet, and talked. The same goddamn conversation they'd had for days now. Surely we're not the only ones, and how many, and where, and what if? "We're probably already dying," Natalie said, turning a baleful eye on Karen's. "Well, we're down here now," she said. "What's your plan, Einstein?" "I don't have a plan. I didn't figure on the snow." "You didn't figure on a lot of things. Cut it out," Lanyon said. "We didn't have to do this, Cliff," Natalie said. "What do you expect me to do? I've known Felicia for years. I've known Dave longer. It's not like we had access to weather reports." No, Karen's thought. That was another thing gone from the old world. Just like that, everything evaporated. By then, the cold had become black, physical. Karen's got to his feet. He tucked Felicia's sleeping bag into the crevices of the sofa, and she moaned. Her eyes fluttered, and she reached for his hand. Karen shook 2 oxycodone out of the bottle. "These'll help you sleep." "Will you stay with me, Dave?" All the way to the end, he thought. And he knew then that at some level, if only half-consciously, he had accepted what he had known in his heart back at the cabin. She was gone. She had been gone the moment she'd slipped on the bed of the scree, and he'd laughed, He remembered that, too. "Whoops," he said, and she had said, "I'm hurt, Dave." Her voice plaintive, frightened, tight with agony. He'd never heard her use that voice in 17 years of marriage, and he knew that she was beyond help. There was no help to be had. What had Natalie said? The rules have changed. We have to watch out for ourselves now. Yet, Lanyon had surrendered the Yukon, and they had knocked on the door before barging into this house, just as they had knocked on the door of the summer cabin in the mountains before that. How long, he wondered, before they reverted to savagery. "Will you stay with me, Dave?" she said. Of course. He slid into his sleeping bag. They held hands by candlelight until the oxycodone hit her and her fingers went limp. He tucked her arm under her sleeping bag. He could smell the wound already suppurating with infection, and lay back. The last of the tea lights burned out. Cairns glanced at the luminescent dial of his watch. 9:30. The streetlight's spectral blue glow suffused the air. He closed his eyes, but sleep eluded him. An endless loop unspooled against the dark screens of his eyelids. Felicia's expression as the earth slipped out from under her feet. His helpless whoop of laughter. "I'm hurt, Dave." He opened his eyes. "You awake, Cliff?" he said. "Yeah. Do you think Natalie's right? We're all going to wind up coughing up blood in 24 hours or so?" I don't know." "Maybe the snow," Karen said. "Maybe the cold has killed the virus. Maybe." They were silent. "One way or the other, we'll find out, I guess," Minion said. Snow ticked at the windows like fingernails. "Let me in. Let me in." "About the Yukon," Karen said. "It doesn't matter, Dave. You would have done the same for me." Would he? Cairns wondered. He liked to think so. "I'm sorry I was an asshole," Minion said. "It doesn't matter. Felicia's going to be okay." "Sure she is. I know." Cairns gazed across the room at the shadowy mound of the other man in his sleeping bag. "What do you figure happened?" "Hell, I don't know. You heard the radio as well as I did. Something got loose from a military lab. Terrorists. Maybe just a mutation. Ebola. Something like that." Another conversation they had had a dozen times. It was like picking at a scab. A long time passed. Cairns didn't know how long it was. "It doesn't matter, I guess," he said, adrift between sleep and waking. "Not anymore," Lanyon said, and the words chased Cairns down a dark hole into sleep. Lanyon woke him into that same unearthly blue light, and for a moment Cairns didn't know where he was. Only that strange undersea radiance, his sense of time and place out of joint, the chill undertow of anxiety. Then it all came flooding back. The plague, Felicia's fall, and the blizzard. Lanyon's expression echoed his unease. "Get up," he said. "What's going on?" "Just get up." Cairns followed him to the window. Natalie crouched there, gazing out into the streets of blowing snow. She held the pistol in one hand. "What is it?" he whispered. "There's something in the snow," she said. "What?" "I heard it. It woke me up." "Do you hear anything, Cliff?" Lanyon shrugged. Wind tore at the house, rattling gutters. Cairns peered into the snow, but if there was anything out there, he couldn't see it. He couldn't see anything but a world gone white. The street lamp loomed above them, a bulb of fuzzy blue light untethered from the earth. "Heard what?" he asked. I don't know. It woke me. Something in the snow." "The wind," Cairns said. "It sounded like it was alive. Listen to it blow out there. You could hear anything in that. The brain, it..." He hesitated. "What?" Natalie said. "All I'm saying is that it's easy enough to imagine something like that. Voices in the wind, shapes in the snow." Natalie's breath fogged the window. "I didn't imagine anything." "Look," he said. "It's late. We're all tired. You could have imagined something. That's all I'm saying." "I said I didn't imagine it." And then, as though the very words had summoned it into being, a thin shriek carved the wind. Alien, predatory, unearthly as the cry of a hunting raptor. The snow muffled it, made it hard to track how far away it was, but it was closer than Cairns wanted it to be. It held for a moment, wavering, and dropped away. A heartbeat passed, then two, and then came an answering cry, farther away. Cairns swallowed hard, put his back to the wall, and slid to the floor. He pulled his knees up, dropped his head between them. He could feel the cold radiating from the window, shivering erect the tiny hairs on his neck. He looked up, his breath unfurled in the gloom. They were both watching him. Lanyon and Natalie. "It's the wind," he said, hating himself as he said it, hating this new weakness he had discovered in himself, this inability to face what in his heart he knew to be true. Came a third cry then, still farther away. "Jesus," Lanyon said. "They're summoning us," Natalie said. "There?" Karen said. "There? Who the hell do you think could be out there in that?" Natalie turned and met his gaze. "I don't know," she said. They checked the house, throwing deadbolts, locking interior doors and windows. Cairns didn't get the windows. He wanted to get inside bad enough, he just broke the glass. Yet, there was something comforting in sliding the little tongue into its grooves all the same. Symbolic barriers, like cavemen drawing circles of fire against the night. As for sleep, forget it. He leaned against the sofa, draped in his sleeping bag, envying Felicia the oblivion of the oxycodone. Her skin was hot to the touch, greasy with perspiration. He could smell, or imagined he could smell, the putrescent wound, the inadequate dressing soaked with gore. Across the room sat Lanyon, the Benelli flat across his legs. At the window, her back propped against the wall, Natalie crating the pistol in her lap. Cairns felt naked with just the hunting knife at his belt. The snow kept coming, slanting down past the street lamp, painting the room with a strange, swimming light. Lanyon's face looked blue and cold, like the face of a dead man. Natalie's too. And he didn't even want to think about Felicia, burning up under the covers, sweating out the fever of the infection. "We should look at her leg," he said. "And do what?" Natalie responded. And what could he say to that because there was nothing to do? Cairns knew that as well as anyone, yet he felt compelled in his impotence to do something, anything, even if it was just stripping back the sleeping bag and staring at the wound, stinking and inflamed, imperfectly splinting, oozing blood and yellow pus. "Just keep doling out those drugs," Lanyon said, and Cairns knew he meant the oxycodone, not the amoxicillin, which couldn't touch an infection of this magnitude, however much he prayed, and he was not a praying man. He couldn't help recalling his mother, dying in agony from bone cancer. The narrow hospital room, stinking of antiseptic, with its single forlorn window. The doctor, a hulking Greek, quick to anger, who spoke in heavily accented English. "How much is left?" Natalie said, and Cairns realized that he had been turning the prescription bottle in his hands. 10, maybe 15 pills. "Not enough," she said. "I don't think it's enough." And a bright fuse of hatred for her burned through him for giving voice to thoughts he could barely acknowledge as his own. After that, silence. Cairns' eyes were grainy with exhaustion, yet he couldn't sleep. None of them could sleep. Unspeaking, they listened for those voices in the storm. At 2, they came. 1, 2, 3 metallic screeches in the wind. Lanyon took one window, Natalie the other, lifting her pistol. Karen stayed with Felicia. She was stirring now, coming out of her oxycodone haze. "What is it?" she said. "Nothing. It's nothing." But it was something. "There," Natalie said. But she needn't have said it at all. Even from his place by the sofa, Karen saw it. A blue shadow darting past the window, little more than a blur, 7 feet long or longer. It was horizontal to the earth, tail lashing, faster than anything that size had any right to be, faster than anything human. There and gone again, obscured by a veil of blowing snow. Cairns' own words mocked him. Imagination. Shapes in the snow. He thought of that icy snow tapping like fingernails at the window. "Let me in." Felicia said, "Dave? What is it, Dave?" "It's nothing," he said. Silence prevailed, shifting veils of snow. "What the hell was that thing?" Lanyon said. And Natalie from her window, "Let's play a game." Nobody said a word. "The game is called What If," she said. "What are you talking about?" Karen said. "What if you were an alien species?" "Oh, come on," Karen said, but Lanyon was grim and silent. "Way ahead of us in technology, capable of travel between stars." "This is crazy, Dave," Felicia said. "What is she talking about?" "Nothing. It's nothing." "And what if you wanted to clear a planet for colonization?" "You read too much science fiction." "Shut the hell up, Dave," Lanyon said. "We're intelligent. They would try to... We're vermin," Natalie said. "What I would do? I would engineer some kind of virus and wipe out 99% of the vermin. Like fumigating a fucking house." "And then," Lanyon said, "then I'd send in the ground troops to mop up." Karen snorted. Dave, it's craziness, that's all, he said. Here, these'll help you sleep. Nothing but wind and snow and the sound of silence in the room. After a time, they resumed their posts on the floor. Felicia, weeping, lapsed back into a drugged sleep. We're going to have to get to the Yukon, Natalie said. We can't see a fucking thing out there, Karen said. At first light, maybe the snow will stop by then. And if it doesn't, Lanyon said, we'll make a run for it. What about Felicia? Karen said. What about her? Cairns looked at his watch. It was almost 3 o'clock. He must have dozed, for he came awake abruptly, jarred from sleep by a distant thud. A dream, he thought, his pulse hammering. It must have been a dream. A nightmare inside this nightmare of dark and endless snow, of a plagued, ravished world, and Felicia dying in agony. But it was no dream. Lanyon and Natalie heard it too. They were already up, their weapons raised, and even as he stumbled to his feet, shedding like water the sleeping bag across his shoulders, it came again. A thump against the back of the house, muffled by snow in the intervening rooms. What is it? Felicia said, her voice drowsy with oxycodone. Nothing, he said. It was nothing. A branch must have fallen. That was no branch, Natalie said. Not unless it fell twice. And twice after that. 2 quick blows, and a third, and then silence. A submarine hush so deep and pervasive that Cairns could hear the boom of his heart. Maybe a tree came down, Karen said. You know better, Lanyon said. Dave, I'm scared, Felicia whispered. We're all scared, Natalie said. Felicia began softly to weep. Shut her the fuck up, Natalie said. Natalie! I said, shut her up! It hurts, Felicia said. I'm afraid. Cairns knelt by the sectional and kissed her chilled lips. Her breath bloomed in the cold air, sweet with the stink of infection, and he didn't think he'd ever love her more in his life than he did in that moment. There's nothing to be afraid of, he whispered, wiping away her tears with the ball of his thumb. It's just the wind. But even she was past believing him, for the wind had died. The snow fell soft and straight through the air. The street lamp was a blue halo against the infinite blackness of space. Natalie's game came back to Cairns. What if? And a dark surf broke and receded across the shingles of his heart. Felicia took his hand and squeezed his fingers weakly. Just don't leave me here, she said. Don't leave me here to die. Never. The glitter of shattering glass splintered the air. Felicia screamed, a short, sharp bark of terror. Shut her up, Natalie snapped. And in the silence that followed, in the shifting purple shadow of the great room with its sectional sofa and the gray rectangle of the flat screen, and their sleeping bags like the shucked skins of enormous snakes upon the floor, Cairns heard someone. Something. Let's play a game. The game is called What If? This something tested the privacy lock of the back bedroom. A slow turn to either side. Click. Click. Silence. Felicia whimpered. Cairns blew a cloud of vapor into the still air. He clutched Felicia's fingers. He remembered a time when they had made hasty love in the bathroom at a friend's cocktail party, half drunk, mad with passion for each other. The memory came to him with pristine clarity. He felt tears upon his cheeks. And still the silence held. Lanyon snapped off the safety of the Benelli. Natalie put her back to the foyer wall, reached out and flipped the deadbolt of the front door. She pushed it a few inches ajar, and snow dusted the threshold. The Yukon locked? She whispered. No, Lanyon said. Once again, the thing tested the lock. Dave, don't leave me. Natalie, Cairns said. She froze him with a glance, and something else she had said came back to Cairns. The rules have changed now. We have to look out for ourselves. God help him. He didn't want to die. He choked back a sob. They wanted children. They had tried for them. In vitro, the whole 9 yards. I won't leave you. I won't leave you, he whispered. Then the privacy lock snapped, popping like a firecracker. The door banged back. Something came, hurtling down the hallway. Something big, hunched over the floor. And God, shedding pieces of itself. 1, 2, 3 as it burst into the room. Guns spat bright tongues of fire, a barrage of deafening explosions. The impacts of the bullets flung the thing backwards, but the pieces, 2 or 3 foot lengths of leg-pumping fury, kept coming. Snapping the Benelli from target to target, Lanyon took 2 of them down. Natalie stopped the third one not 3 feet from Karen's throat. It rolled onto the floor, curving needle teeth snapping, leathery hide gleaming in the snow-blown light, and it was still. Those alien cries echoed in the darkness. "It's time to go," Natalie said. Lanyon moved to the door. Felicia clutched at Karen's hand, seizing him with a tensile strength he did not know she still possessed. The cocktail party flashed through his mind. They had wanted children. "Felicia," Karen said. "Help me." "No time," Natalie said. And Lanyon, "I'm sorry, Dave." The moment hung. Karen's wrenched away his hand. "Time to go," Natalie said again. "We can't wait. You have to decide." And regular as a metronome inside his head, "The rules have changed. The rules have changed. The rules. The rules." Natalie ducked into the night. A moment later, Lanyon followed. Glass shattered at the back of the house. 1 window, 2 windows, 3. "Don't leave me, Dave," Felicia sobbed. "Don't leave me." Outside, the Yukon roared to life. "The rules have changed. We have to watch out for ourselves now." "Dave," Felicia said, "I'm scared." God help him. He didn't want to die. "Shh," he said, brushing closed her eyelids with his fingers. "Never. I'll never leave you. I love you." He bent to press his lips to hers. His fingers fumbled at his belt. They closed around the blade. A moment later, he was running for the Yukon. Billy Weaver had traveled down from London on a slow afternoon train with a change at Swindon on the way, and by the time he got to Bath it was about 9 o'clock in the evening. The moon was coming up out over a clear starry sky over the houses opposite the station entrance, but the air was deadly cold and the wind was like a flat blade of ice on his cheeks. "Excuse me," he said, "but is there a fairly cheap hotel not too far away from here?" "Try the Bell and Dragon," the porter answered, pointing down the road. "They might take you in. It's about 1/4 of a mile along the other side." Billy thanked him and picked up his suitcase and set out to walk the 1/4 mile to the Bell and the Dragon. He had never been to Bath before. He didn't know anyone else who lived there. But Mr. Greenslade at the head office in London had told him it was a splendid city. "Find your own lodgings," he had said, "and then go along and report to the branch manager as soon as you've got yourself settled." Billy was 17 years old. He was wearing a new navy blue overcoat, a new brown trilby hat, and a new brown suit, and he was feeling fine. He was walking briskly down the street. He was trying to do everything briskly these days. Briskness, he had decided, was the common characteristic of all successful businessmen. The big shots up at head office were absolutely fantastically brisk all the time. They were amazing. There were no shops on this wide street that he was walking along, only a line of tall houses on each side, all of them identical. They had porches and pillars and 4 or 5 steps going up to their front doors, and it was obvious that once upon a time they had been very swanky residences. But now, even in the darkness, he could see that the paint was peeling from the woodwork on the doors and the windows, and that the handsome white facades were cracked and blotchy from neglect. Suddenly, in a downstairs window that was brilliantly illuminated by a street lamp not 6 yards away, Billy caught sight of a printed notice propped up against the glass in one of the upper panes. It said, "Bed and breakfast." There was a vase of yellow chrysanthemums, tall and beautiful, standing just underneath the notice. He stopped walking and moved a bit closer. Green curtains, some sort of velvety material, were hanging down on either side of the window, and the chrysanthemums looked wonderful beside them. He went right up and peered through the glass into the room, and the very first thing he saw was a bright fire burning in the hearth. On the carpet in front of the fire, a pretty little dachshund was curled up asleep with its nose tucked into its belly. The room itself, so far as he could see into the half-darkness, was filled with pleasant furniture, too. There was a baby grand piano and a big sofa and several plump armchairs, and in one corner he spotted a large parrot in a cage. Animals were usually a good sign in a place like this, Billy told himself, and all in all it looked to him as though it would be a pretty decent house to stay in. Certainly it would be more comfortable than the Bell and Dragon. On the other hand, though, a pub would be more congenial than a boarding house. There would be beer and darts in the evenings, and lots of people to talk to, and it would probably be a good bit cheaper, too. He had stayed a couple nights in a pub once before, and he liked it. He had never stayed in any boarding houses, though, and to be perfectly honest, he was a bit frightened by them. The name itself conjured up images of watery cabbage, rapacious landladies, and a powerful smell of kippers in the living room. After dithering about like this in the cold for 2 or 3 minutes, Billy decided that he would walk on and take a look at the Bell and Dragon before making up his mind. He turned to go, and now a queer thing happened to him. He was in the act of stepping back and turning away from the window when all at once his eye was caught and held in the most peculiar manner by the small notice that was there. Bed and breakfast, it said. Bed and breakfast. Bed and breakfast. Bed and breakfast. Each word was like a large black eye staring at him through the glass, holding him, compelling him, forcing him to stay where he was and to not walk away from that house. And the next thing he knew, he was actually moving across from the window to the front door of the house, climbing the steps that led up to it, and reaching for the bell. He pressed the bell. Far away in a back room, he heard it ringing. And then at once, it must have been at once because he hadn't even had time to take his finger from the bell button, the door swung open and a woman was standing there. Normally you ring the bell and you have to wait at least half a minute for the door to open, but this dame was like a jack-in-the-box. He pressed the bell, and out she popped. It made him jump, actually. She was about 45 or 50 years old, and the moment she saw him, she gave him a warm, welcoming smile. "Please come in," she said pleasantly. She stepped aside, holding the door wide open, and Billy found himself automatically starting forward into the house. The compulsion, or, more accurately, the desire to follow after her into that house was extraordinarily strong. "I saw the notice in the window," he said, holding himself back. "Yes, I know. I was wondering about a room." "It's all ready for you, my dear," she said. She had a round pink face and very gentle blue eyes. "I was on my way to the Bell and Dragon," Billy told her, "but the notice in the window just happened to catch my eye." "My dear boy," she said, "why don't you come out of the cold?" "How much do you charge?" 5 and 6 a night, including breakfast. It was fantastically cheap. It was less than half of what he had been willing to pay. "If that is too much," she added, "then perhaps I can reduce it just a tiny bit. Do you desire an egg for breakfast? Eggs are expensive at the moment. It would be 6 less without the egg." 5 and 6 is fine," he answered. "I should like very much to stay here." "I knew you would. Do come in." She seemed terribly nice. She looked exactly like the mother of one's best school friend welcoming one into the house to stay for the Christmas holidays. Billy took off his hat and stepped over the threshold. "Just hang it there," she said, "and let me help you with your coat." There were no other hats or coats in the hall. There were no umbrellas, no walking sticks, nothing. "We have it all to ourselves," she said, smiling at him over her shoulder as she led the way upstairs. "You see, it isn't very often I have the pleasure of taking a visitor into my little nest." The old girl is slightly dotty, Billy told himself, but at 5 and 6 a night, who gives a damn about that? "I should have thought you'd be simply swamped with applicants," he said politely. "Oh, I am, my dear, I am, of course I am. But the trouble is, I'm inclined to be just a teeny-weeny bit choosy and peculiar, if you see what I mean." "Ah, yes. But I'm always ready. Everything is always ready day and night in this house, just in an off chance that an acceptable young gentleman will come along. And it is such a great pleasure, my dear. Such a very great pleasure when now and again I open the door and see someone standing there who is just exactly right." She was halfway up the stairs, and she paused with one hand on the stair rail, turning her head and smiling down at him with pale lips. "Like you," she added, and her pale blue eyes traveled all the way down the length of Billy's body, to his feet, and then up again. On the first floor landing, she said to him, "This floor is mine." They climbed up a second flight. "This one is all yours," she said. "Here's your room. I do hope you'll like it." She took him into a small but charming front bedroom, switching on the light as she went in. "The morning sun comes right in the window, Mr. Perkins." "It is Mr. Perkins, isn't it?" "No," he said. "It's Weaver." "Mr. Weaver, how nice. I've put a water bottle between the sheets to air them out, Mr. Weaver. It's such a comfort to have a hot water bottle in a strange bed with clean sheets, don't you agree? And you may light the gas fire at any time if you're chilly." "Thank you," Billy said. "Thank you ever so much." He noticed that the bedspread had been taken off the bed, and that the bedclothes had been neatly turned back on one side, all ready for someone to get in. "I'm so glad you appeared," she said, looking earnestly into his face. "I was beginning to get worried." "That's all right," Billy answered brightly. "You mustn't worry about me." He put his suitcase on the chair and started to open it. "And what about supper, my dear? Did you manage to get anything to eat before you came here?" "I'm not a bit hungry, thank you," he said. "I think I'll just go to bed as soon as possible, because tomorrow I've got to get up rather early and report to the office." Very well then, I'll leave you now so you can unpack. But before you go to bed, would you be kind enough to pop into the sitting room on the ground floor and sign the book? Everyone has to do that because it's the law of the land, and we don't want to go breaking any laws at this stage in the proceedings, do we? She gave him a little wave of the hand and went quickly out of the room and closed the door. Now, the fact that this landlady appeared to be slightly off her rocker didn't bother Billy in the least. After all, she was not only harmless, there was no question about that, but she was also quite obviously a kind and generous soul. He guessed that she had lost a son in the war or something like that and had never gotten over it. So, a few minutes later, after unpacking his suitcase and washing his hands, he trotted downstairs to the ground floor and entered the living room. His landlady wasn't there, the fire was glowing in the hearth, and the little dachshund was still sleeping in front of it. The room was wonderfully warm and cozy. I'm a lucky fellow, he thought, rubbing his hands. This is a bit of all right. He found the guest book lying open on the piano, so he took out his pen and wrote down his name and address. But there were only 2 other entries above his on the page, and as one always does with guest books, he started to read them. One was a Christopher Mulholland from Cardiff. The other was Gregory W. Temple from Bristol. That's funny, he thought suddenly. Christopher Mulholland. It rings a bell. Now where on earth had he heard that rather unusual name before? Was he a boy at school? No. Was it one of his sister's numerous young men, perhaps, or a friend of his father's? No, it wasn't any of those. He glanced down again at the book. Christopher Mulholland, 231 Cathedral Road, Cardiff. Gregory W. Temple, 27 Sycamore Drive, Bristol. As a matter of fact, now that he came to think of it, he wasn't all that sure that the second name didn't almost have as much of a familiar ring about it as the first. Gregory Temple, he said aloud, searching his memory. Christopher Mulholland. Such charming boys, a voice behind him answered, and he turned and saw his landlady sailing into the room with a large silver tea tray in her hands. She was holding it well out in front of her and rather high up, as though the tray were a pair of reins on a frisky horse. They sound somehow familiar, he said. They do? How interesting. I'm almost positive I've heard those names before somewhere. Isn't that queer? Maybe it was in the newspapers. They weren't famous in any way, were they? I mean, famous cricketers or footballers or something like that? Famous, she said, setting the tea tray down on the low table in front of the sofa. Oh no, I don't think they were famous, but they were extraordinarily handsome. Both of them, I can promise you that. They were tall and young and handsome. My dear, just exactly like you. Once more, Billy glanced down at the book. Look here, he said, noting the dates. This last entry is over 2 years old. It is? Yes, indeed, and Christopher Mulholland's is nearly a year before that, more than 3 years ago. Dear me, she said, shaking her head and heaving a dainty little sigh. I would have never thought it. How time does fly away from us all, doesn't it, Mr. Wilkins? It's Weaver, Billy said. Weaver. Oh, of course it is, she cried, sitting down on the sofa. How silly of me, I do apologize. In one ear and out the other, that's me, Mr. Weaver. You know something? Billy said. Something that's really quite extraordinary about all of this? No, dear, I don't. Well, you see, both of these names, Mulholland and Temple, I not only seem to remember each of them separately, so to speak, but somehow or another, in some peculiar way, they both appear to be sort of connected together as well, as though they were both famous for the same sort of thing, if you see what I mean. Like Dempsey and Tunney, for example, are Churchill and Roosevelt. How amusing, she said. But come over here now, dear, and sit down beside me on the sofa and I'll give you a nice cup of tea and a ginger biscuit before you go to bed. You really shouldn't bother, Billy said. I didn't mean you to do anything like that. He stood by the piano watching her as she fussed about with the cups and saucers. He noticed that she had small, white, quickly moving hands and red fingernails. I'm almost positive it was in the newspapers I saw them, Billy said. I'll think of it in a second, I'm sure I will. There's nothing more tantalizing than a thing like this which lingers just outside the borders of one's memory. He hated to give up. Now wait a minute, he said. Wait just a minute. Mulholland. Christopher Mulholland. Wasn't that the name of the Eton schoolboy who was on a walking tour through the West Country, and then all of the sudden... Milk? She said. And sugar? Yes, please. And then all of the sudden... Eton schoolboy? She said. Oh no, my dear, that can't possibly be right, because my Mr. Mulholland was certainly not an Eton schoolboy when he came to me. He was a Cambridge undergraduate. Come over here now and sit next to me and warm yourself up in front of this lovely fire. Come on, your tea's all ready for you. She patted the empty place beside her on the sofa, and she sat there smiling at Billy and waiting for him to come over. He crossed the room slowly and sat down on the edge of the sofa. She placed his teacup on the table in front of him. "There we are," she said. "How nice and cozy this is, isn't it?" Billy started sipping his tea. She did the same. For half a minute or so, neither of them spoke, but Billy knew that she was looking at him. Her body was half turned towards him, and he could feel her eyes resting on his face, watching him over the rim of her teacup. Now and again, he caught a whiff of a peculiar smell that seemed to emanate directly from her person. It was not in the least unpleasant, and it reminded him, well, he wasn't quite sure what it reminded him of. Pickled walnuts? New leather? Or was it the corridors of a hospital? "Mr. Mulholland was a great one for his tea," she said at length. "Never in my life have I seen anyone drink as much tea as dear, sweet Mr. Mulholland." "I suppose he left fairly recently," Billy said. He was still puzzling his head about the two names. He was positive now that he had seen them in the newspapers, in the headlines. "Left?" she said, arching her brows. "But my dear boy, he never left. He's still here. Mr. Temple is also here. They're on the 3rd floor, both of them together." Billy set down his cup slowly on the table and stared at his landlady. She smiled back at him, and then she put out one of her white hands and patted him comfortingly on the knee. "How old are you, my dear?" she asked. 17. 17! She cried. "Oh, it's the perfect age! Mr. Mulholland was also 17, but I think he was a trifle shorter than you are. In fact, I'm sure he was, and his teeth weren't quite so white. You have the most beautiful teeth, Mr. Weaver. Did you know that?" "They're not as good as they look," Billy said. "They've got simply masses of fillings in them at the back." "Mr. Temple, of course, was a little older," she said, ignoring his remark. "He was actually 28, and yet I never would have guessed it if he hadn't have told me. Never in my whole life. There wasn't a blemish on his body." "A what?" Billy said. "His skin was just like a baby's." There was a pause. Billy picked up his teacup and took another sip of his tea, then he set it down again gently into its saucer. He waited for her to say something else, but she seemed to have lapsed into another of her silences. He sat there staring straight ahead of him into the far corner of the room, biting his lower lip. "That parrot," he said at last. "You know something? It had me completely fooled when I first saw it through the window from the street. I could have sworn it was alive." "Alas, no longer." "It's most terribly clever the way it's been done," he said. "It doesn't look in the least bit dead. Who did it?" "I did." "You did?" "Of course," she said. "And have you met my little Basil as well?" She nodded towards the dachshund curled up comfortably in front of the fire. Billy looked at it, and suddenly he realized that this animal had all the time been just as silent and motionless as the parrot. He put out a hand and touched it gently on the top of its back. The back was hard and cold, and when he pushed the hair to one side with his fingers, he could see the skin underneath, grayish-black and dry and perfectly preserved. "Good gracious me," he said. "How absolutely fascinating." He turned away from the dog and stared with deep admiration at the little woman beside him on the sofa. It must be most awfully difficult to do a thing like that. "Not in the least," she said. "I stuff all my little pets myself when they pass away. Will you have another cup of tea?" "No, thank you," Billy said. The tea tasted faintly of bitter almonds, and he didn't much care for it. "You did sign the book, didn't you?" "Oh, yes." "That's good, because later on, if I happen to forget what you were called, then I can always come down here and look it up. I still do that almost every day with Mr. Mulholland and Mr. Temple," Billy said. "Gregory Temple. Excuse my asking, but haven't there been any other guests here except them in the last 2 or 3 years?" Holding her teacup high in one hand, inclining her head slightly to the left, she looked up at him out of the corner of her eyes and gave him another gentle little smile. "No, my dear," she said. "Only you." It started as a publicity stunt, and it was in poor taste, but since when have taste and publicity been close friends? The university was of the third-rate variety, not famous enough to be considered by the rich kids from China, not industry-focused enough to be a target for corporate funding. This university was a mid-tier nothing left to battle it out for funding with the endless sea of other universities. Its IVF research labs were quite acceptable, and the professors knew what they were doing, but for some of those in management, that wasn't enough. They dreamed of headlines. It was of course an idea concocted in management, the labs being populated by myopic detail-oriented professionals who had no idea why anyone would even consider such an experiment. A clone of Utsi? Why? Ötzi was this guy who got frozen in the Alps over 5,000 years ago, so he represented some of the earliest viable human DNA. There was of course enough biological data available to make a clone, but the professors in the lab couldn't grasp why they would want to. There was nothing special about his DNA. Ötzi had been as human as the rest of us, and the creation of a clone would likely throw an expensive process simply to reveal that people are essentially the same in all times as in all places. The whole thing was just ignored by the lab until deliveries of biological material arrived from Italy and had to be signed for. There was even a small camera crew filming the delivery. Apparently, someone in management was doing something more than simply cashing his paycheck and scratching his ass, because this cloning project appeared to have been funded, and quite healthily too. The professors were dragged into meetings where their mild-mannered reservations were met with contractual obligations. Dabbling with genetic material in a lab and documenting the results is one thing, but a clone required a host, and in this, the professors thought they had the perfect excuse to scupper the whole thing and get back to their own little projects. Money proved to be the predictable motivator it always was, and the funding provided for this project included a very generous support package for the mother throughout the life of the clone. Once this piece of information got out to the rest of the staff, every female lab tech within the age requirements applied, and even a few of the more junior professors tried their luck. By this stage, there was a marketing and media team in charge, and they made the offer to a pretty young lab tech named Pamela for no other reason than that she looked good on camera. The project never got any more than grudging compliance from the lab staff, but the extra effort suddenly being made on hair, makeup, and general personal grooming among the staff spoke its own contrasting words on the subject. Pamela carried her implemented embryo to term with no real problems, much to the discontent of the film crew and marketing assholes who were busy trying all they could to dramatize what was fundamentally mundane. Pamela kept working away in the lab until the week before delivery. It was at this stage where the project started to make some waves in the mainstream media, with some religious nuts showing up outside the university gates to decree the project as sacrilegious. To the lab staff, it was nothing more than another minor nuisance, and to the marketing people, it was simply far too little a fuss for their expectations. There were some rumblings from some conservative politicians who were simply trying to use the situation to boost their own profile, but by the time cameras were pointed at their faces, the baby had been successfully birthed, and we had not gotten to the place in history where politicians were quite ready to call for infanticide on television. Not just yet. The baby was named Oates, a decision by the marketing team. They figured people would not like the foreign nature of the progenitor's name, and wanted something more familiar and friendly. Oates was born with the usual amount of drama blessedly kept behind closed doors. No woman deserves those moments to be filmed and fussed over. The baby was presented to the world all pink and unremarkable, and despite the best efforts of the hype-starved marketing team, he stayed as dull as all babies are. Filming days became fewer and far between, and the marketing team likewise seemed to become fewer too. As the baby grew, the team in the lab warmed to him, and his mother became less of a lab assistant and more of like a mascot, the lab mom. Oates lived with his mother, and only came to the lab with his mother. There were tests carried out, but a lot of his time was spent as most babies spend their time, feeding, playing, and socializing. Pretty soon, the camera crews were absent, and all of those non-contractually bound to receive ongoing funding were cut. As a publicity project for the university, the project was essentially a failure, only serving to cheapen the reputation of the university further. Life went on with Oates the baby becoming Oates the toddler, and this period saw him demonstrating quick learning skills. Spatial awareness and coordination were good, problem-solving skills were good. Of course, in toddlers, there's a tendency to read too much into these early progressions. Children do advance at different rates, and this does not necessarily reflect the results of later capabilities. When Oates enrolled in school, he had no difficulty in getting into the finest institution on scholarship. He still had some notoriety in his origin, and his academic capability had proven to be high. Once in school, he lived up to those expectations. He also excelled in his social capability, being well liked by nearly everyone. Pamela had returned to taking her work more seriously in the university now that she was more free from her duties as a mother. Oates returned to the lab regularly enough, ostensibly to spend time with his mother, but in reality he was periodically tested. His biological sampling was all within baseline normal. He was in the upper end of average in speed, dexterity, visual acuity, neural kinetics, the whole list, but not so high to be disconcertingly alien. A lot of it was explained away with his rigorous upbringing, something that the lab staff felt that they were all partially responsible for. His intellectual capacity was another story. He was far above average, and at first it was raising some warning bells amongst the staff, but as he grew a little older, it showed signs of plateauing. Although everyone wanted Oates to be great, no one wanted him to be a freak show. That would come with some grim consequences, especially given his origins. On that trajectory, Oates could find himself institutionalized and invasively studied. It was a Monday morning. Oates was in school, and Pamela was in an unusually pensive mood in the lab. She was clearly distracted. It was at lunchtime when she sought out her best friend. Over lunch, they talked, but it was obvious for both of them that they were talking around an invisible barrier. Something Pamela needed to say, but was working herself up to. Eventually, after an uncomfortable silence, Pamela spoke her mind. During the weekend, she had been spending some time with Oates. Their conversation had turned to the lab tests, which he still regularly attended. Oates had looked at her in what she claimed was a shockingly mature way, and had then said that he had been deliberately underperforming in them for many years. He said that he knew that being overachieving was a risky thing to be, and that it made everyone uncomfortable. He had gone on to say that he does the same thing in school for similar reasons. This confession did not have the discomforting effect on Pamela's friend that it had originally had on Pamela, and her friend comforted her. Pamela felt like she was perhaps overreacting. She was preparing to get back to her tasks, lunch break over, when her phone buzzed a notification. She gave a casual check to her phone, and it was from an unrecognized number. Upon opening, she read, "I know you will tell one of your friends about what I told you over lunch. It's okay. Secrets are tough to carry alone." Pamela felt a chill run through her. Oates didn't have a phone. Oates was 12 years old when he laid his next confession upon his mother. Pamela had felt a certain cold distance for a short while after the text message incident, but it had faded away eventually. At 12, Oates was at the top of his class, for every class. He was a marvel and a minor celebrity in his school. Everyone loved him. He was mature and articulate, while also being warm and engaging. It was just after dinner, a simple affair of mashed potatoes and fried pork that Pamela could cook on autopilot after a tiring week in the lab, when Oates said in the mature manner which he had, "We need to talk." This caused dread that she had thought long gone to unravel within Pamela. "I know that the last time we had a serious talk, you were quite scared, but I felt I had no choice at the time. I was young, and I desperately needed to share my secret with someone, even just a little bit. I have many friends, but you are my mother, and I trust you, at least as much as I can trust anyone." With this opening, Pamela felt a rush of love which overwhelmed her dread, mostly. Oates went on, "I've long been curious as to why I was so different from everyone else, and for a time it really bothered me. School has been a bore in most respects, but it has allowed me to develop my social skills more fully, and for that I am grateful, but it does get in the way of my research. I discovered the spyware on your laptop long ago, and I built a wall around it for when I wanted to use the internet more freely." This was news to Pamela. She had no idea there was spyware on her laptop. She presumed it was part of the ongoing experiment that was her son, and she intended to scrap her laptop and buy a new one first thing the next day. Showing near prescience in his understanding of his mother, Oates immediately said, "Do not discard the laptop. If you do so, they will know that I have uncovered their surveillance scheme, and they will move to find alternative means to monitor my inquiries. For now, we can let everyone believe I'm gifted, yet not threateningly so." Pamela asked a fair yet rather obvious question. Why would they be threatened by you? Phrased in such a nebulous manner, expressing both her wish to understand why anyone would feel threatened by intelligence, while perhaps subconsciously expressing her own worry. Is Oates a threat? People are the product of people. Those people who reproduced did so at the cost of the lives of well-being for others. It has been our nature for as long as we have history to view anything that can be aligned against us as such that it will surely become aligned against us, and people have always taken what they see as preventative measures against potential threats, and this is an end of itself, part of the problem we face today. Intellect such as mine is radically divergent to the current average. I would without a single doubt be taken away from where I can have any liberty should it become known." This perhaps failed to answer the deeper meanings of his mother's question, but he went on. "To put it simply, the reason why I'm so different to others is because of breeding. Throughout the entire process of history, two key elements have shaped human evolution. The first is this: The most terrible of us have outperformed the most capable of us. Evolution has not rewarded kindness, and innovators have without exception been predated upon by the manipulators. This is factually consistent across all societies. To compound this, throughout history, the more educated and enlightened of citizens have always been outbred by the dull and the mean. The aggregate result of the past few thousand years of human breeding is that the entire human race is the sum result of the most stupid, the most terrible, and the most corrupt that has gone before. Except for me. Pamela was an educated woman. She was intellectually experienced, and life had allowed her to garner at least her fair share of wisdom. But this was to her a shocking way to think. It bypassed her logic circuits and triggered a deep-rooted sense of offense. Yet she had no retort, no cards to play in defense of this damning judgment. She could in no way accept that her son was correct, yet she knew full well that he was. Oates was not finished, and he continued. I was very lucky to realize my danger before it was too late, and managed to rein in my urge to excel to my fullest. I was also lucky to have a caring mother who in her own way inspired me to do the best that I could with the talents that I have. It is in this spirit that I wish to share with you my plan. Pamela was wordless. There was nothing she could say. His praise had touched her, but she could not shake the feeling that even these words were part of his larger stratagem. Yet she loved her son, and she knew that she would gracefully accept the praise and bury the sense of manipulation in time. This is what is going to happen. I will finish school, top of my class. I will cultivate specific friendships which will allow me to, after graduation from Harvard, move into politics. Before that, of course, I will go through officer training school in the military, where I will make the necessary contacts to ensure a frictionless path as I advance through the political ranks. By the time I am 35 years old, I will become the youngest man to be elected president. From this position, I will be able to make the legislative changes necessary to allow the other part of my plan to come to fruition. I have already identified the genetic structures which have become debased through the millennia of harmful selection, and I have put in action through some unwitting contacts I have made a mechanism through much of this harm can be biologically eliminated in future generations. A system will be put in place to control breeding and ensure that we are put back on track as a truly intelligent species. Furthermore, in my position I will institute systems and rules to push back against the established structures which protect the parasites of our society and promote their predation upon those who deserve better. There will inevitably be some pushback during the initial stages of implementation, mainly from less developed nations that it will not be able to apply economic pressure to, but I am confident that I can see this mission to its completion before my death. This is not going to be easy, but I know that I have no choice. I know that we can be better. His mother, with tears in her eyes, went around the table and embraced her son, and he gripped her as the boy his terrifyingly adult speech had occluded. From the table, she slid the knife he had used to section his dinner, and with the precision of a trained lab technician, she plunged the blade into his neck one-handed, over and over, while she held his writhing body in the other hand.